Hi, my name is Erin Murphy, and I'm a Deputy Director and Senior Fellow with a Chair on India and Emerging Asia Economics. I'm joined today by Dr. Victor Cha, who is the President of the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department and Professor at Georgetown University. We're here to discuss Donald Trump and the G7. The 2025 G7 Leader Summit takes place in Canada in June 2025. And here is the beautiful logo. The last time Trump attended the G7 in Canada was in 2018. And this particular picture went viral from that summit. So, Victor, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what is going on here.
Well, this picture, as you said, Erin, did go viral from the last time the G7 was in Canada. And to put it very simply, Trump blew up the G7 summit. He arrived late. He called the host, Trudeau, different names. He called for Russia to be brought back into the G7, which was a non-starter for everybody. And then he famously left the G7 and then tweeted or messaged from the airplane, Air Force One, that the United States was not copacetic with the joint statement. So this picture, I think, really sort of sums up that particular summit meeting.
Yeah, I think everyone looks particularly thrilled here. But given the reciprocal tariffs that Trump has levied against all the countries attending the summit, shouldn't we expect some similar fireworks from this one?
I think that's very much could be the case. I mean, he's levied tariffs against everybody who is attending the summit. But at the same time, we believe that the time would be better used, not focusing on the histrionics and Trump's antics, and really focusing the conversation on reform of the G7.
So for the G7 agenda, it's changed over time, hasn't it?
Yes, it has. As you know well, Erin, because you participated in our research on this, we've looked at what G7 leaders have focused on, and it's changed quite a bit over time. This is an example of how much the G7 leaders have focused really on global issues rather than only economic issues or macroeconomic issues when they come together. This is a data scrape of the summit statements made by G7 leaders between 2018 and 2023, and you can see the priorities are very clear: the Indo-Pacific, economic resilience, food security, digital competitiveness, climate change, Ukraine, global economy, disarmament, and labor. So a pretty ambitious global agenda.
And I think for us that focuses on Asia, it's really nice to see that number one is the Indo-Pacific.
Yes.
So
yes.
That's great for us.
Yes.
So for the next slide that we have, wondering if that you can explain a little bit about this chart here.
Yeah, so this is simply a chart that explains how the G7's agenda has become global, but the G7 as a group is not really representative of the world like it used to be. There was a time when the G7 countries represented almost 70% of the world GDP. In the 1980s. Today that is barely at 40%, and G7 countries represent less than 10% of the global population. So, you know, the dilemma is the G7 wants to do more, and I think the world wants the G7 to do more as a global governance institution, but it's not really representative or has the capabilities to take on this large agenda.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the G7 and it needing reform, but it needs reform because it has an expanded mandate. We saw that in the previous slide. And as global governance institution, how should we think about that with the G7, with the reform mandate?
Yeah, so again, the G7 didn't ask for this particular task, but when institutions like the UN Security Council are stymied by Russia and China, when the WTO, which you know well, 160 plus members, hasn't been able to deal with the weaponization of trade by the United States and China. Increasingly, people are looking to the G7 to play some sort of role. And so what we did when we looked at this was we looked at what the capabilities of the G7 countries were and compared them to other countries that are also high performers in the areas that matter for the G7. So this particular ranking is an overall ranking of the G7 plus two other countries, South Korea and Australia. And what we did here was look at how all these countries perform on the list of G7 priorities we had on the previous slide according to over 300 plus publicly available metrics of performance. And what we found as a total group was that countries like Australia and South Korea, which are not in the G7 today, actually perform as well, if not better, than G7 countries on some of these issues. And I think if we go to the next slide, I can just show you an example of this. So these were the 7 out of the 9 issue areas that we had on the earlier slide that G7 leaders identified as being important to the G7. And if we just take one example here of sustainable development, here if we look at how Australia and South Korea, and in this case Spain as well, perform on sustainable development across 70 indicators of performance, they actually do as well, if not better, than existing G7 members. So the point of all this is to say G7 has an expanded mandate. There are other countries that could help, and there are other countries that consistently perform as well, if not better, than G7 countries, and could be part of a discussion about expanded membership.
Right, and I think from the previous slide and this slide, I think there is an argument to be made about expanded membership. But are there other reforms that are necessary?
Yes. So one of the things that we also looked at in our study, Erin, that you participated in, is in addition to membership, there are questions about the G7 being a very informal group. It's a very informal and unique group, allows them to be flexible, to have trust with one another, but that also leads to some inefficiencies. So one of the things we focused on was a more formal agenda setting process that involves not just the host, right? The host usually sets the agenda, but a more formal agenda setting process involving a troika of the previous year's G7 host, the current and the future, the next year's G7 host, together to come together to formulate an agenda. The other area that we talked about was building connections with the Global South, with the OIC, the Organization for Islamic Countries, China, ASEAN, to take what has traditionally been seen as a rich club of nations and have them work with these other constituencies to build the agenda together.
Well, thank you for all this, Victor. And you can read more about G7 reforms on the CSIS Geopolitics website, as well as Victor's article with Dr. John Hamre and John Eikenberry in Foreign Affairs online. Thank you for joining us.